She had 40 seconds to stop it, and no one would listen. The delivery container sat wedged against the loading dock of Riverstone Medical Center like it belonged there. Unmarked, dented along one corner, left by a driver nobody had thought to follow up with. Ranger had locked onto it the moment Emily Carter rounded the East Corridor entrance. 70 pounds of Belgian Malinois, 8 years of service in places that didn't show up on maps, and he had gone completely, unnervingly still. Not a growl, not a bark, just that rigid, low-center stance that Emily had seen once before, outside a compound in a country she wasn't supposed to be in, and never forgot. Emily dropped to one knee. Her hand found the back of Ranger's neck. "I see it," she said quietly. That was when Security Supervisor Dale Pruitt told her to remove herself from the property. If you've stayed with me this far, subscribe, hit the like button, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning had started unremarkably. Emily Carter, 34, showed up to her shift at Riverstone Medical Center the same way she had for the past 11 months, early, in worn-out sneakers, a travel mug of bad coffee going cold before she even reached the nursing station on the 3rd floor. She was a float nurse, which meant she went where the hospital needed her and answered to whoever happened to be in charge that day. It also meant she had no real allies, no department to call home, no senior nurse watching her back. That was fine. She'd operated in worse conditions. She hadn't told anyone about her background, not her supervisor, not the other nurses she sometimes ate lunch with, not the charge nurses who occasionally gave her a hard look for moving too fast or asking too many questions. As far as Riverstone Medical Center was concerned, Emily Carter was a competent, if reserved, float nurse who kept to herself, never called in sick, and had a retired military working dog she sometimes brought to the loading dock entrance in the mornings because the hospital's security team had once informally cleared it as a therapy visit for certain patients. Ranger was not a therapy dog, but he was well behaved, and the arrangement had never caused a problem. Until this morning. Emily had been running 4 minutes late, which was unusual for her. She'd taken the East Corridor entrance rather than the main lobby because it was closer to the staff elevator, and she was already mentally rehearsing a handoff with the night shift nurse on the cardiac floor, a woman named Dorinda, who had a habit of leaving incomplete notes. Ranger trotted beside her on a short leash, relaxed, ears up. He'd been retired for 2 years and carried some stiffness in his left rear haunch from an injury she never liked to talk about, but his temperament was still sharp and his nose was... He stopped. Not a slow down. A full, sudden stop. Emily's arm jerked forward with his leash before she caught herself. "Ranger." He didn't look at her. He was facing the loading dock, body low, weight shifted forward, tail dead still. Emily followed his line of sight and saw the container. Standard-looking freight unit, about 4 feet tall, the kind that showed up at hospital receiving areas a dozen times a week. This one was sitting 10 feet from the dock door, slightly off to one side, as if it had been set down in a hurry and the driver hadn't bothered to position it properly. Emily's heart rate changed. It wasn't panic. She didn't do panic, but it was something. The thing you feel when a pattern you've trained for years to recognize suddenly appears in a context where it shouldn't be. She took Ranger's leash in both hands and stood there a moment watching him. He didn't waver. His breathing was controlled, nose working in that quiet, methodical way she knew. Then Dale Pruitt came through the dock door. Pruitt was Riverstone's head of security operations, a heavy-set man in his mid-50s who wore his authority the way some men wore cologne. Too much, all the time. Emily had dealt with him twice before. Once when she'd flagged a medication discrepancy that turned out to be real, and once when she'd asked about a locked supply closet that the overnight staff said had been producing a chemical smell. Both times, Pruitt had looked at her like she was a weather inconvenience. "Carter," he said, not quite making it a greeting. "What's going on? That container." Emily kept her voice level. "When was it delivered?" Pruitt glanced at it. "I don't know. Receiving handles? Has anyone verified the manifest?" He crossed his arms. "Is there a problem?" "My dog is alerting on it." Pruitt looked at Ranger, then he looked back at Emily. Something shifted in his expression. Not concern, more like the particular kind of skepticism that men like him reserved for situations they'd already decided weren't real. "Your dog," he said. He's a retired military working dog, detection trained, 8 years of operational service. He's also, far as I can tell, a pet that you've been smuggling into a medical facility. Emily felt the words land but didn't let them move her. That container needs to be checked. I need you to call your receiving team right now and find out where it came from and what's in it. Pruitt didn't move. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. You're causing a disruption. I haven't disrupted anything. My dog is telling me something is wrong. Your dog is standing still. That's what an alert looks like. He stared at her. You need to leave the property. 2 nurses walking in from the parking lot had slowed down to watch. A janitor near the dock door had stopped mopping. Emily could feel the shape of the moment, how it looked from the outside, a woman in scrubs with a large dog getting into it with a security supervisor before her shift had even started. She knew how it looked. She also knew what Ranger's body was telling her. Mr. Pruitt, she said carefully, I'm asking you to take 30 seconds and call receiving. If the manifest checks out and the delivery driver is accounted for, fine. I'll apologize and go upstairs. But if you can't verify it, I'm not going to stand here and verify a shipping container because your dog is in a funny mood. He turned to the janitor. Ortega, can you hold the door? Stop. Emily stepped forward, not aggressively, but definitively. Do not open that door. Pruitt turned back slowly. His face had gone from skeptical to something harder. Ma'am, you have 5 seconds to take that animal and walk off this property before I call the police. Call them, Emily said. That's actually the right call. Call the police, call the fire marshal, call whoever you need to call. Just do not let anyone near that container until someone can verify what's inside it. She said it calmly, clearly, the way she'd learned to communicate under conditions that made calm clarity feel physically difficult. One of the nurses near the parking lot had her phone out. The janitor was watching with his mop handle held like he didn't know what to do with his hands. Pruitt called the police. He also called hospital administration. The first person from administration to arrive was a woman named Nadine Bosch, director of operations for Riverstone Medical Center, and she arrived already angry. Nadine Bosch was the kind of administrator who treated every deviation from schedule as a personal affront. She was 47, precise in her clothing, and had built her reputation on keeping this hospital running without drama. Emily had seen her type before, in briefing rooms and command structures, in the specific hierarchy of institutions that valued order above accuracy. What is happening here? Nadine said. It wasn't a question. Your float nurse is refusing to leave, Pruitt said. Emily looked at Nadine directly. That container hasn't been verified. My dog is alerting on it. I'm asking for a 5-minute delay before anyone approaches it while we confirm the delivery origin. Nadine looked at her the way people look at a spot on the floor they've already decided to clean later. Are you a security professional? I have relevant training, yes. Are you currently on shift? I was about to start. So you're not working, you've brought an animal onto hospital property, and you're trying to tell my security team how to do their jobs. Nadine straightened. Mr. Pruitt, please have her removed. Mrs. Bosch, that's all. Pruitt nodded and started toward Emily. She stood her ground. Ranger remained locked on the container. I am trying to tell you that there may be people in that building who are in danger, Emily said, and her voice was still measured, but something underneath it had changed, something tight and urgent that she usually managed to keep invisible. I understand what this looks like. I understand you think I'm a problem employee making a scene. I'm asking you to treat this as a possibility, not a certainty. 1 call to receiving. That's it. You have 30 seconds to leave voluntarily, Pruitt said, close enough now that she could smell his aftershave. I'm not leaving. She wasn't saying it to be defiant. She was saying it because Ranger hadn't moved, and 8 years of deployments had taught her that the dog was almost never wrong. Pruitt put his hand on her arm. Ranger turned his head and made a sound that was barely audible. Not a growl, more like a low vibration, and Pruitt's hand came off immediately. That dog just threatened me. He notified me that you touched me, Emily said. There's a difference. The patrol car arrived 7 minutes later. Officer Marcus Tully, Ashford PD, 22 months on the job, which meant he was still young enough to want to demonstrate authority and not quite experienced enough to know when a situation required him to listen before acting. He got out of the car, assessed the scene in under 10 seconds. Security supervisor, hospital administrator, one nurse with a large dog, small crowd of onlookers, and walked directly to Pruitt. "What's the situation?" "Trespassing," Pruitt said. "She's refusing to leave the property." Tully turned to Emily. "Ma'am, this is private property. You've been asked to leave." "I'm aware," Emily said. "I'm also asking that before anyone touches that container," she gestured, "someone verifies the delivery origin and manifest." "Is there a specific reason?" "My dog is alerting on it. He's a trained explosive detection animal." Tully looked at Ranger, then at Pruitt. Something moved across his face, a flicker of something that might have been uncertainty. But Nadine Bosch was right there. And people like Nadine had a gravity to them in moments like this, a social mass that pulled judgment in a specific direction. "Ma'am," Tully said, "if you have a legitimate concern, you can file a report. Right now I need you to step off the property." "And what happens to the container while I'm filing a report?" He didn't answer that. "Officer, I'm not asking you to evacuate the hospital. I'm asking you to make one call, to your dispatch, to the fire marshal, to anyone who can verify what's in that box before people walk past it." She held his gaze. "That's a reasonable request." Tully hesitated. Nadine Bosch said, "Officer, she's disrupting hospital operations during peak morning hours. I need this resolved." And that was the end of the hesitation. "I need you to come with me, ma'am." "I'm not going to do that." "Ma'am, I will not leave that container unmonitored." Emily's voice didn't waver. "My dog has not moved. He has not moved since he first scented that container 7 minutes ago. Do you know what that means?" "I know you need to step off the property." "It means he's hit on something." She was speaking faster now, controlled, but faster. "A trained detection dog doesn't hold a passive alert for 7 minutes on nothing. He's not barking because he's trained not to bark in a civilian environment, but that stance, look at his stance, that's a trained response. I've seen it in active deployment. I've seen it find things that would have killed people." Tully had his hand on his handcuffs. He looked uncomfortable. "He's been trained to detect it," Emily said, dropping her voice. "Don't walk those people past that container." From behind her, she heard Nadine Bosch say something under her breath to Pruitt. A few of the watching nurses had their phones out now. The janitor had moved back toward the door. Tully said, "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for trespassing and obstruction." The handcuffs came out. Emily looked at him, calm, direct, the kind of stillness that isn't submission, but isn't anger either. "You're making a mistake. Turn around and place your hands." "I know you're following protocol, and I know you think I'm the problem here. I'm going to comply because I don't want this to escalate." She turned slowly, hands out. "But I'm asking you to look at my dog before you decide you're done here." Tully put the cuffs on. They were tight, but not deliberately so. A woman in the watching crowd made a sharp noise, something between a gasp and a protest. Emily heard it. She heard the murmur that ran through the small group of nurses and visitors and staff who had gathered near the entrance. She heard one of the nurses say something about calling someone. She heard Nadine Bosch thank the officer. Ranger hadn't moved. He was still facing the container, body rigid, weight forward, doing the only thing he'd been trained to do in a moment like this: hold. Tell his handler what he knew. Wait. Emily looked back at him over her shoulder. "Sit," she said softly. He sat, but he kept his eyes on the container. Tully walked her to the patrol car and the small crowd watched. Some of them looked away. Some of them didn't. One of the nurses, a young woman, dark hair, still in her jacket from the parking lot, was on her phone speaking quietly, and something in her posture suggested she wasn't calling a friend. The parking lot was filling up with the ordinary business of a Tuesday morning. Visitors carrying flowers, families walking slowly, a food delivery driver navigating the service entrance with a flatbed. From the third-floor window, Emily could see lights on in the cardiac ward. There were patients up there, patients in the rooms that faced the loading dock side, families visiting, staff starting rounds. Tully opened the rear door of the patrol car. Emily looked back at the loading dock one more time. Nadine Bosch was speaking into her phone, her posture the composed, forward-leaning posture of someone managing a problem. Pruitt was walking toward the dock entrance. One of the maintenance staff was approaching the container with a box cutter in his hand. "Officer," Emily said. Her voice was very quiet. Tully had one hand on the door. "Don't let that man open the container." Tully looked. The maintenance worker was maybe 8 feet from the container now, box cutter out. "Sir," Emily raised her voice, "Sir, do not touch that container." The maintenance worker looked up. Tully frowned. And then an old man who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, gray-haired, thick through the shoulders in the way of men who carried weight into age. A hospital visitor's badge clipped to his jacket, took 2 steps forward and said something. He didn't shout. He just spoke. But his voice had a register to it that moved through crowd noise the way a frequency moves through water, without effort, without competition. He said, "That dog found a bomb." The maintenance worker stopped. Everyone stopped. The old man wasn't looking at Pruitt or Nadine Bosch or Officer Tully. He was looking at Ranger, still sitting in his rigid wait-forward alert, still locked on the container, 8 years of training holding in the cold morning air like a sentence that couldn't be taken back. Emily watched the old man's face and knew, the way she always knew when she was talking to someone who'd been somewhere real, the particular stillness that comes from having already lived through the worst thing once and spent the years after learning to recognize the early signs. "I've seen that dog's posture in 3 different countries," the old man said, to no one in particular, to all of them. "You do not open that container." The maintenance worker stepped back. Nadine Bosch's phone call went silent. Tully's hand was still on the patrol car door, and Emily could see it. The exact moment when his certainty stopped being certainty. She said quietly through the open space beside the door, "Now, will you listen?" Tully didn't answer her. But he didn't put her in the car either. He stood with one hand on the door and one hand doing nothing in particular, which was its own kind of answer. The answer of a man who had been certain 30 seconds ago and was no longer certain of anything. The old man hadn't moved. He was still watching Ranger with the focused, unhurried attention of someone reading a document he'd seen before in a different language but recognized anyway. Nadine Bosch recovered first. That was the thing about people like Nadine. They didn't stay rattled long because staying rattled required acknowledging that something had rattled them. "Sir," she said, walking toward the old man with her tablet tucked under one arm, her voice dropping to the register she used for managing situations she'd already categorized. "I understand your concern, and we appreciate—" "Don't." He said it without looking at her, still watching the dog. "I'm not concerned. I'm telling you what that dog is doing. He's a retired animal. He's a trained explosive detection K9 in a passive alert. Trained, which means someone trained him, which means whoever trained him knew what they were doing." He finally turned to look at Nadine, and his eyes were pale gray, the kind of gray that had been somewhere cold. "You got maybe 600 square feet of populated space within 40 feet of that container. You want to keep arguing with me, or you want to start moving people back?" Nadine opened her mouth. The old man said, "What's your name?" She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Your name. Because if there's a device in that container and it goes off in the next 10 minutes, I want to be precise when I tell the investigators what you said." The tablet slipped slightly under her arm. She caught it. Tully was watching this exchange from the patrol car door, and Emily could see him doing the math. The visible, uncomfortable math of a young officer recalculating everything he'd committed to in the last 8 minutes. His hand had come off the door entirely. His weight had shifted back. "Officer," Emily said, keeping her voice low. "The handcuffs." He looked at her. "I need my hands free. If you're going to make any calls, make them now, but I need my hands free to manage my dog, and I need to be able to direct people away from that dock entrance. I can't just— Marcus." She used his first name deliberately, not to be familiar, but because she needed him to hear a human being talking to him and not a detainee. "I'm not asking you to decide that I'm right. I'm asking you to cover yourself. If that container is nothing, you uncuff me in 20 minutes and write a report. If it's something, and you left me in the back of a patrol car while people walked past it—" She stopped. Let him finish the sentence himself. He finished it. She could see it on his face. He pulled the key. The cuffs came off, and Emily's hands were moving before she'd fully straightened up, reaching for Ranger's lead, checking his alert posture without touching him in a way that would break it. He was still locked, still absolutely still. That was what people who'd never worked with a detection animal didn't understand. The stillness wasn't the dog being calm. It was the dog screaming in the only language he'd been given. "Back from the dock," she said, not loudly, but with the particular directional quality that cuts through ambient noise. Two nurses who'd been standing near the dock entrance heard it and moved. The maintenance worker, whose name turned out to be Perry, she'd find out later, a 40-year-old father of 3 who'd worked at Riverstone for 11 years, backed up without being told twice. The old man was already moving people. He didn't announce himself or explain. He just positioned himself between the gathering crowd and the container and said, quietly and with the kind of authority that doesn't require volume, "Go inside. Use the main entrance. Move away from the dock." People went. Tully was on his radio now, voice low and rapid. Emily caught fragments. "Possible hazardous device. Requesting supervisor. K9 detection indicator at Riverstone Medical." She heard dispatch come back with a tone she recognized. Not alarm exactly, more like the machine of emergency response beginning to engage. Gears catching. Nadine Bosch was standing 6 feet away, perfectly still, her tablet at her side. Something had gone out of her posture. Not all of it, she was still Nadine Bosch, but enough. Emily looked at her. "You need to start a quiet internal movement of patients away from the east wing. 3rd floor, 2nd floor. Don't announce it over the PA. Don't use the word evacuation. Tell staff there's a maintenance issue requiring a precautionary relocation. Keep it calm." Nadine said, "I need to consult with—" "You don't have time to consult." Emily wasn't being unkind. She was being factual. "If I'm wrong, you tell patients it was a false alarm and a miscommunication, and you apologize for the inconvenience. That's manageable. If I'm right and you wait for a conference call, you don't get to manage anything." Nadine looked at the container, looked at Ranger. "How long has he been in that posture?" she asked, and her voice was different now. The operational varnish gone, something more honest underneath. 14 minutes. Nadine made a call. Dale Pruitt had gone quiet. That was notable. He was a man who filled silence instinctively, who treated any pause in conversation as an opening to reassert himself. But he was standing near the dock door now, with his arms at his sides, and he hadn't said anything in 3 minutes. Emily didn't look at him long. He wasn't the priority. The old man came back to her side. Up close, he was bigger than he'd looked at the edge of the crowd. Not fat, just densely built. The kind of frame that carries age in layers. He had a visitor's badge that read guest/cardiology and a name tag beneath it she didn't look at. "What unit?" he said. Not a question. She met his eyes. "I can't tell you that." He nodded. That was an answer too. "What branch first? Army? Then medical? Then other things?" He looked at her for a moment. "You're doing fine," he said, which was not a compliment so much as an assessment, delivered the way someone with the authority to make assessments delivers them. "I need your name," she said. "Walt Greer. Used to be Sergeant Major, 2nd Marines. Now I come in Tuesdays to sit with my brother while he does dialysis." "Mr. Greer, I need you to help me keep that crowd back. Not because you have authority here, you don't, but because they'll listen to you, and right now that matters more than authority." Walt Greer looked at the container, then he rolled up his left sleeve and looked at his watch, an old one, analog, and said, "Yep, that's..." The first responders arrived in stages, which is how it always goes and never feels fast enough. A 2nd Ashford PD unit came first, 2 officers, one of whom was senior enough to have the specific look of a person who had been doing this long enough to have stopped being surprised. Not by the situation itself, but by the fact that the situation always looked messier in person than it did in a dispatch call. He talked to Tully for 45 seconds, looked at Ranger, looked at the container, and then got back on his radio and requested a hazmat assessment and a call to the county EOD desk. Emily heard that last part, and something in her chest settled slightly. EOD, Explosive Ordnance Disposal. The right people, if not the right people yet. The problem was time. Not the abstract problem of time that you discussed in briefings, But the specific physical problem of time that you felt in your upper chest when you were standing 40 feet from something that might be counting down, and you had no way of knowing the number it was counting toward. She kept Ranger in position. She didn't call him off. As long as he was holding the alert, she was holding the alert. Two of them, broadcasting the same message at different frequencies to anyone who would read it. The senior officer, whose name was Sergeant Bev Lattimore, came to stand beside Emily. She was a compact woman, mid-40s, hair pulled back, and she had the practiced calm of someone who had learned that calm was a professional tool and used it accordingly. "You're the one who flagged this?" "Yes." "What's your background?" "Combat medic, additional training in IED recognition and detection K9 handling. I worked alongside EOD units on 4 deployments." Lattimore nodded slowly. "Okay." She said it like she was filing something. "How confident are you?" Emily looked at Ranger. "Confident enough to still be here." Lattimore looked at the container. "It came off a delivery truck?" "That's what I was told. No one's been able to pull the manifest yet. We're working on that." Lattimore stepped back and spoke quietly into her radio. Behind them, the hospital's east entrance had started its quiet reconfiguration. Emily could see it in the movement of staff, small, deliberate redirections, families being guided toward the main lobby, with explanations that didn't include the word bomb. It was good. It wasn't fast enough, not from where Emily was standing, but it was moving. Pruitt appeared at her elbow. She hadn't heard him coming. "For the record," he said, low enough that Lattimore wouldn't catch it, "I followed procedure." Emily didn't look at him. "Now's not the time." "I'm just saying I had no reason to—" "Dale!" She turned to face him, and whatever he saw in her expression made him stop. "If there's something in that container, the only thing that matters right now is getting every person in that building away from it. What you had reason to do 30 minutes ago is a conversation for a different day. Right now, I need you to go to the receiving office, pull every delivery record from the last 72 hours, and bring them to Sergeant Lattimore. Can you do that?" He looked at her. Something shifted in him. Not an apology, nothing as simple as that. More like the recognition that he'd been operating inside a version of this situation that had turned out to be the wrong one. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." He left. Boy. The county EOD desk called back in 11 minutes. 11 minutes that Emily spent standing 40 feet from the container, managing Ranger's leash, tracking the movement of civilians through the east-facing area of the hospital, and watching the situation in the parking lot evolve with the particular speed and disorder that emergency response always has when it's real, rather than a drill. What the EOD desk said to Sergeant Lattimore, Emily didn't hear directly. What she heard was the pause afterward, and the tone of Lattimore's voice when she said, "Copy that. We're holding the perimeter." Lattimore came back to Emily. "State EOD is 40 minutes out," she said. Emily looked at the container. 40 minutes. They're moving. I know they're moving. I'm telling you, 40 minutes is a number we need to take seriously. Lattimore met her eyes. "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that if someone placed a device in that container and timed it for delivery to a hospital loading dock during peak morning hours, they didn't set the timer for 45 minutes after estimated arrival." She kept her voice steady. "They set it for sooner." Lattimore was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need?" "I need everyone cleared from the east wing and the adjacent parking structure. I need the main evacuation to happen now, PA announcement or not. And I need someone to find out if there's a former EOD tech anywhere in this county who can get here in under 20 minutes, because 40 minutes may not be what we have." Lattimore's jaw tightened. She looked at the hospital entrance, the families coming in, the visitors, the staff doing the invisible, careful work of moving people without triggering a panic, and she made a decision the way good officers make decisions, which is not comfortably, but quickly. "Dispatch, this is Lattimore. I'm upgrading the threat assessment at Riverstone Medical to Level 2. Request immediate notification to hospital administration for full evacuation protocol. Alert County Fire and EMS for standby." She looked at Emily while she said it. "And find me any available EOD qualified personnel in the county. Any branch. Any age." Emily exhaled. It wasn't relief. Nothing about the next 40 minutes was going to feel like relief. but it was the machine finally moving in the right direction. Walt Greer found her again 10 minutes later, in the controlled chaos of the east parking lot where patrol vehicles had started blocking vehicle entry points, and a fire unit had pulled up to the service road. "They doing the full pull?" he asked. "Starting it now." He looked at the hospital entrance. A nurse was guiding an elderly man in a wheelchair through the main doors and out toward the designated gathering area in the north parking lot, the man's IV pole attached to the chair arm, his expression bewildered but cooperative. Behind him, 2 more nurses with 2 more patients, a woman in a hospital gown clutching a cell phone, a child in a visitor sticker being held by someone who is probably a father. "My brother's up there," Walt said. "I know. Dialysis machine. He's mid-session. They'll know how to manage the disconnect. The nursing staff up there will know. He hates being moved." Emily glanced at him. "He's going to be okay." Walt was quiet for a moment. Then, "You got family?" "Not locally." "Where?" She didn't answer that directly. "I'm good." He accepted that. People who'd been certain places understood when a non-answer was the answer. Over by the dock, Ranger was still in position. Emily had looped his leash around a stanchion at a distance that kept him locked on the container while freeing her hands. She kept checking him. He kept not moving. A young woman in scrubs appeared at Emily's side, the dark-haired nurse from the parking lot, the one who'd been on her phone when Tully put the cuffs on. She looked like she was about 26, and she had the specific energy of someone who had been holding back something they needed to say. "I'm Priya," she said. "4th floor nursing. I called the state health safety line when they were arresting you." Emily looked at her. "Okay. I wanted you to know someone called. I didn't know if... I wasn't sure what to do, but it looked wrong, so I called." "That was the right call." Priya nodded, but didn't leave. "Is there really a bomb?" Emily looked at the container, at Ranger. "My dog thinks so." "And you?" "My dog has never been wrong." Priya went quiet, then, "What can I do?" Emily thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. "Go to the north gathering area. They're going to need nursing staff there for patients being evacuated. Some of them will be scared, and some of them will be on medications, and some of them will have questions no one's going to have answers to yet. Be the person who has calm." "Okay." Priya said it like she meant it. "Okay." She went. The argument started at the command post. The command post was Lattimore's patrol vehicle, improvised, which was how all real command posts started. Not with a tent and a whiteboard, but with someone's car hood and a radio and whoever needed to be talking to each other. Tully was there, and 2 of the newer officers, and a fire captain named Rosario, who had arrived with the 1st engine unit and who was now conducting his own assessment of the East Wing's structural exposure. Nadine Bosch was also there, because Nadine Bosch was always where decisions were being made, regardless of whether anyone had invited her. "You can't do a full evacuation announcement without board authorization," she said. She said it to Lattimore, not to Emily, which was a choice. Lattimore said, "I have the authority to order evacuation in a credible threat scenario." "Credible," Nadine said the word carefully. "Based on a dog and a former employee. Based on a trained detection K9 in a confirmed alert posture and the assessment of a credentialed medic with EOD deployment experience." "She's a float nurse who..." "Ma'am," Lattimore's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I understand you have institutional concerns. I am not dismissing them. I am telling you that when EOD arrives and determines there's nothing in that container, you can have a very detailed and justified conversation about process and authorization and the disruption this caused. I will support that conversation. Right now, I need you to let your staff do the evacuation." Nadine looked at Emily. Emily said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. The argument wasn't really about authorization. It was about the particular terror that administrators feel when control leaves their hands. And that was a terror Emily understood, but couldn't afford to manage for her right now. "The board is going to hear about this," Nadine said. "Yes," Lattimore said. "They will." Nadine made another call. This one lasted longer than the others. Emily walked back to Ranger. 31 minutes after the EOD request, a man named Derek Ferris pulled into the east parking lot in a personal vehicle, a 5-year-old pickup truck with a cracked front bumper, and showed his credentials to the officer at the vehicle checkpoint. He was 49 years old, recently retired from the Army's 74th Ordnance Company, and he lived 23 minutes from Riverstone Medical Center because he'd come back to Ashford after his last deployment to take care of his mother, who had passed 8 months ago, which meant he was currently a man with specific skills and nowhere particular to be. Lattimore had found him through a county veteran services liaison who knew him from a job fair. He came through the checkpoint with his credentials in his hand and walked directly to Emily, because Lattimore had described the situation in enough detail that he knew who to find. He was not a smooth person. He had a way of walking that suggested multiple old injuries making themselves known in his knees, and he hadn't shaved in a few days. And when he got to Emily, he looked at Ranger first and said, "How long has he been holding?" 38 minutes? Ferris looked at the container. "Where'd it come from?" "Receiving office is still trying to trace the manifest. Driver isn't responding." That landed. She saw it on his face, the specific weight of that particular piece of information. "What type of container?" "Standard freight unit. Looks like aluminum composite, about 4 feet by 3. One seam along the top that looks slightly irregular." "From here?" "From here." Ferris studied it for a moment. He didn't move toward it. He just looked, with the particular focus of a man reading something most people couldn't see. "Okay," he said finally. "Can you assess?" "I can get closer than you can." "I know." He looked at her. "You worked with EOD?" "Alongside. Not as." "What's your gut?" Emily looked at the container, at the slightly irregular seam along the top, at Ranger, still rigid, still locked. At the loading dock behind it, the dock door that Perry, the maintenance worker, had almost opened, the dock that led directly into the receiving corridor, which led to the east elevator bank, which led to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors, where patients were still being moved. "My gut says it's real," she said. "My gut has been saying that for 40 minutes. Ferris nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Mine too." He borrowed a radio from Lattimore and got on the EOD frequency to brief the state team that was still 20 minutes out. While he talked, Emily watched him, and she watched the container, and she watched the hospital entrance where the evacuation was still moving, slower than she wanted, faster than it had started, the imperfect machinery of emergency response doing what it did. Behind her, she heard Officer Tully on his phone. She heard fragments. "My sergeant authorized it." "Yes, sir, I understand. I was following." She didn't turn around. The crowd of onlookers at the parking lot perimeter was growing. People who'd been inside, evacuated now, stood in clusters with their phones up. Visitors who'd arrived to find the entrance blocked stood at the tape line looking confused and afraid. A woman in a winter coat was crying, and the person next to her had their arm around her but was also on the phone, and everyone was watching the container and watching Ranger and watching Emily standing beside him, and none of them knew her name yet. That would change, but not yet. Ferris came back to her. He'd gotten off the radio. "State EOD is 18 minutes out. I gave them the preliminary description. They're bringing full kit." "Good." "There's something else." She looked at him. "I described the seam irregularity to their team lead." He paused. "He asked me to confirm one thing. He asked if there are any secondary containers, anything adjacent to the primary, smaller units, anything that might have been delivered with it or staged near it." Emily's eyes went immediately to the right side of the loading dock, to a smaller container, barely visible, pushed against the wall, the kind of thing that looked like a normal piece of dock staging equipment and had been so unremarkable that no one, including Emily, had looked at it twice. Ranger had never turned his head toward it, but detection dogs were trained to alert on the primary source. If the primary unit had a stronger concentration, a secondary unit at distance could... "Ferris." "Yeah." "There's a secondary container." She pointed. He followed her line of sight. His face went very still. Then he got back on the radio, and his voice had changed, not louder, not faster, but with a controlled flatness that she recognized as the voice people used when something had just become significantly worse. "This is Ferris at Riverstone Medical. I need to update my preliminary assessment. Possible 2-unit configuration, requesting EOD accelerate ETA and notify tactical support. The radio crackled back. Emily looked at the hospital entrance. There were still people inside, still patients on the floors above her. The evacuation was moving, but it was not finished, and it was not going to be finished in the time she'd initially calculated, because the time she'd initially calculated had been based on one device, and now they might be talking about two. Lattimore appeared at her shoulder, having heard the transmission. "What does 2 units change?" she asked. Emily answered honestly, because it was too late for anything else. "Everything," she said. "It changes everything." Lattimore didn't waste time asking follow-up questions. She turned back to her radio and started giving orders in the clipped, no-pause cadence of someone who had crossed the line from managing a situation to running one, and the difference was audible to everyone standing within 20 feet of her. Emily was already moving, not toward the container, toward the hospital entrance. The evacuation had been proceeding on the assumption of a single threat source in a defined location, which meant the staging areas, the patient routing, the staff assignments, all of it had been calculated around one blast radius. 2 units changed the geometry entirely. If the secondary container was positioned against the east dock wall and the primary was at the dock entrance, they weren't looking at a single cone of effect. They were looking at overlapping zones, which meant the north gathering area, where Priya was, where the evacuated patients were being directed, might be sitting inside the outer edge of the secondary unit's range. Emily did the math in her head while she walked. It wasn't precise math. She didn't have specs, didn't know payload, didn't know construction. But she'd stood in the aftermath of enough of these to have a working model of what she didn't want to find out the hard way. She found Lattimore's second officer, a young man named Garza, at the entrance checkpoint. "The north gathering area," she said. "How far from the east dock wall?" Garza pulled up something on his phone, a satellite image of the property, which meant someone had been thinking ahead, which was good. He measured with his thumb. "Maybe 60, 70 feet. Move it." She said it without softening. "Move everyone from the north lot to the far side of the main building. West entrance, push them to the street. Right now." "That's going to take..." "I know what it's going to take. Start." Garza looked at her for exactly 1 second longer than she wanted him to, then got on his radio. Emily went back to Ferris. "Barnett." Derek Ferris was a deliberate man. Not slow, deliberate, which was a different thing. He didn't move without assessing, didn't speak without meaning it, and he'd spent enough years working with things that killed people if you miscalculated to have burned out whatever part of the brain generates impatience. He was crouched at the edge of the safe perimeter now, elbows on his knees, looking at both containers with the specific focus of a man who was reading them. "Tell me what you see," Emily said. "Primary unit, seam irregularity suggests the top panel was removed and resealed. Resealing on those composite units is never perfect if you're doing it in the field. You get a slight gap, maybe 2 millimeters, but the light catches it differently." He pointed. She couldn't see it from where she stood, but she trusted his sight picture. "Secondary unit is smaller, looks like a standard medical supply box, the kind that comes with equipment deliveries. It's been moved. See the drag marks on the dock surface? Someone positioned it after it was set down. That's intentional placement. Trigger configuration? Can't know from here, but the placement of the secondary, if it's a supplemental charge, it's designed to catch people moving away from the primary. That's a standard fragmentation pattern for a 2-device setup targeting a building entrance." Emily absorbed that without reacting. "So anyone evacuating through the east entrance would move toward the secondary? Yeah. We've already redirected east entrance traffic to the main lobby. Then whoever set this up didn't account for someone redirecting before the primary went. Or they didn't expect anyone to find it at all." Ferris looked at her. "Your dog." "My dog." He was quiet for a moment. "How long ago did he alert?" 44 minutes. Ferris looked at his watch. The analog watch face caught the morning light. "If this is timed," he said carefully, 44 minutes is a long run for a countdown on a delivery time device. Usually you want the window between delivery and detonation short enough that no one has time to respond. Unless something interrupted the original timeline. Like what? Emily thought about the delivery driver who wasn't answering, the manifest that didn't pull clean, the container that had been set down slightly wrong, angled, as if placed in a hurry. Like the driver was supposed to position it at the dock door and didn't. If someone spooked him, or if something changed on the route, then the timer started at a point that assumed the device would be in a different position. More people, more exposure. Ferris stood slowly. Which means we might have more time than I initially thought, or less, depending on when it was armed. Neither of them said what that meant out loud. They didn't need to. The state EOD team was 15 minutes out. Inside the hospital, the evacuation had reached the complicated middle stage, which was the stage no one planned for adequately and everyone experienced as organized chaos that felt like the other kind. The nursing staff on the second and third floors had responded well. Emily would learn this later, in pieces, from people who were there. They disconnected patients from monitoring equipment, managed IV lines and catheter bags and portable oxygen units, and moved people through the stairwells in the quiet, purposeful way of professionals who drilled for this and were now finding out which parts of the drill were accurate and which parts had assumed conditions that didn't exist. The fourth floor was harder. That was where the ICU satellite unit operated, and ICU patients didn't move like other patients. They moved like things that could break, because they could, and the nurses up there were making judgment calls that weren't in any protocol. Who could be safely moved in the next 10 minutes? Who needed another 5 to stabilize for transport? Who was close enough to a critical threshold that moving them fast was its own kind of danger? The charge nurse on 4 was a woman named Dolores Huang, who had been a nurse for 22 years and had worked 3 hospitals in 2 states and had never once evacuated an ICU satellite under an active bomb threat. She was doing it now with 4 nurses, 2 aides, and a respiratory therapist who had showed up for his shift 20 minutes ago and was now pushing a ventilator-dependent patient down the stairwell access corridor in a transport chair while a nurse manually bagged the patient's airway with one hand and held the chair's headrest with the other. Dolores knew about Emily Carter because Priya had called up to the floor from the north parking lot during the first evacuation phase and told her, "There's a nurse downstairs named Emily Carter. She flagged this. Listen to anything she says." Dolores had filed that information and moved on because filing information was something she did automatically, and moving on was something she was currently doing at a speed she hadn't moved at in years. She had 7 patients left on the floor when the overhead PA system finally activated. Attention, Riverstone Medical Center staff and visitors. This is an emergency notification. Please follow staff directions and proceed to designated exit areas. This is not a drill. Dolores counted her remaining patients, looked at her staff, made the decisions that had to be made. Walt Greer found his brother on a gurney in the main lobby, mid-disconnect from the dialysis machine, looking irritated and slightly gray from interrupted treatment. "The hell is happening?" his brother said. His name was Eugene, and he was 67, and he had the characteristic pallor of a man whose kidneys had stopped doing their job, and he hated being moved. "There's a situation outside," Walt said. "What kind of situation?" "The kind where we're going outside now." "I'm not finished." "Eugene." Walt put his hand on his brother's arm, the way you touch someone when you're done negotiating. "We're going outside." Eugene looked at his face, stopped arguing. Walt pushed the gurney himself. He was 63 and his right shoulder had been rebuilt twice, and pushing a loaded gurney across a lobby floor was not something his body thanked him for. But he pushed it anyway because the nurse who should have been pushing it was managing 2 other patients, and the aide who'd been assigned to Eugene had been redirected to the stairwell, and sometimes you just push the gurney yourself. A nurse appeared beside him, young, dark hair, the one he'd seen on her phone in the parking lot earlier. "I've got him," she said, reaching for the gurney handles. "I've got him," Walt said. "Sir, he needs a clinical escort." "Then walk beside me and be clinical." Walt kept moving. "What's your name?" "Priya." "Priya, what's his oxygen saturation at?" She checked the portable monitor clipped to the gurney rail. 94. "Is that okay for transport?" "It's acceptable. He's going to feel dizzy." "I always feel dizzy," Eugene said from the gurney. "That's actually reassuring," Priya said. Walt pushed the gurney toward the main exit. Behind him, the lobby was a controlled current of people moving in the same direction, and the PA was still announcing, and somewhere outside, near the east dock, Ranger was still sitting in his alert posture, still broadcasting his message, still waiting. Okay. The state EOD team arrived in 2 vehicles, a black van and a support truck, at 13 minutes after Ferris's updated transmission, which meant they'd pushed their speed and it showed. 4 technicians in partial protective gear, equipment cases, a remote-controlled assessment robot that looked nothing like the robots in movies and everything like a purpose-built machine. Their team lead was a woman named Specialist Tamara Voss, who moved like she'd done this 100 times because she had, and who came directly to Ferris and Emily without stopping. EOD Voss, what am I looking at? Ferris briefed her in 60 seconds. Clean, factual, no editorial. Emily watched Voss take it in and saw the recognition, the specific, quick, non-performative recognition of an expert encountering a problem she'd been trained for. You're Carter? Voss asked Emily directly. Yes. The K9, Belgian Mal, detection trained. He's still in posture? 51 minutes. Voss looked at Ranger across the cleared lot, still sitting, still locked. That's a committed alert. He's a committed dog. Where'd you work? Places I can't name. Voss nodded. Okay. She turned to her team. Delacroix, get the bot staged. I want a visual assessment of both units before anyone goes forward. Tran, set up the disruption equipment on the truck, but hold position. Rivera, coordinate with the Ashford units on perimeter. I need a minimum 100-foot clearance on all sides, and if that means pushing civilians into the street, push them into the street. She looked back at Emily. You stay with me. It wasn't an invitation. Yes, ma'am, Emily said. Meet. The robot was a squat tracked unit with a camera array and a small manipulator arm, and it moved across the cleared dock area with a slow, mechanical deliberateness that felt unbearably slow from where Emily was watching. The feed came up on a tablet that Voss was holding, and Emily stood at her shoulder and looked at the images as they came in. The primary container, close up, the seam irregularity was obvious. The resealing job had been done with adhesive that hadn't fully set. You could see the slight pulling at the corners, the uneven compression. The manipulator arm nudged the corner of the top panel, and it gave slightly, which it shouldn't have if it were a properly sealed freight container. Primary is accessible, Voss said. Somebody opened and resealed this. Recently, that adhesive's still soft. She scrolled the camera along the base of the container. No visible external trigger wires. That doesn't mean no trigger. It means no visible ones. The robot moved to the secondary unit. The secondary was a medical supply box, white with a blue hospital cross logo that Emily didn't recognize, not a Riverstone logo. The drag marks Ferris had noticed were clear on the camera feed. The box had been moved approximately 2 feet from its original drop position, angled deliberately to face the dock entrance. Voss expanded the camera view on the secondary unit's bottom edge. There, she said. Emily saw it. A thin wire, maybe 3 inches of it visible, running along the base of the box and disappearing under the dock edge cover. Not a timer wire, a trigger wire. Which meant, it's command detonated, Emily said. Possibly. Voss's voice was controlled. Or it's a secondary trigger set to the primary. If the primary goes, the secondary goes. Sympathetic detonation. Or something wired to it. We won't know until we're in. Voss lowered the tablet. Ferris, your assessment of the primary. Timer or command? Timer's my first guess, Ferris said. If it's command, someone's still in range. You'd need line of sight or close proximity signal. And your perimeter? Voss was already scanning. What's your closest building structure to the east? Emily said, the parking structure, 4 stories east side of the property, 200 feet from the dock. Voss looked at the structure. Clear it, she said. Now. 2 of Lattimore's officers were moving before Voss finished the sentence. If it's command detonated from the garage, Voss said, someone's been watching this whole response. She was already moving toward the equipment truck. Delacroix, I need the disruptor configured for a 2-unit sequence. Start with primary. Delacroix, a lean technician with gloved hands, was already working. Timeline? Emily asked. For the disruption sequence? 12 minutes to configure, 3 to deploy. Voss pulled on her protective jacket. How many people are still inside the hospital? Emily looked at Lattimore, who had her radio up. West stairwell is clear, Lattimore said into the radio. 4th floor, I need a count. 4th floor, do you copy? Static. 4th floor. The radio came back broken. Then, 4 patients, 2 staff, moving now. 4 patients still on the 4th floor. Emily looked at the container. At the secondary unit, at the parking garage 200 feet away where someone might be sitting with a detonation trigger and watching a response team configure equipment in what looked to them like slow motion. She did not let herself think about the 4 patients by name or circumstance. That was a trick the brain played on you in these moments. You started to individualize the stakes, to picture the faces, and then you stopped functioning as an operator and started functioning as a person who was afraid, and afraid wasn't useful right now. She thought about process, sequence, what needed to happen in what order. Voss, she said. Voss looked up from the equipment truck. If someone's in the parking garage with a command trigger and they see your team deploying the disruptor, they may decide not to wait for whatever timer is running. Voss held her gaze. Yes. So the disruption deployment and the garage clearance need to happen simultaneously, not sequentially. Voss looked at Lattimore. What's your timeline on the garage? Lattimore was already on the radio. 2 officers entering now, 6 floors, mostly empty at this hour. Maybe 5 to 7 minutes to clear. 5 to 7, Voss said. She looked at Delacroix. How fast can you configure? 8 minutes if I rush it. 7. 7 is not safe. What's less safe? 7 minutes and a configured disruptor, or 10 minutes and someone in that garage who decides we're too close. Delacroix looked at the equipment, made a decision the way technicians make decisions, with technical knowledge and the understanding that technical knowledge has limits that the situation does not respect. 7, he said, but I need Rivera helping me. Voss nodded. The next 7 minutes were the kind that left marks. Emily stationed herself at the edge of the cleared zone and managed the information flow, which was not glamorous work and was not recognized as such, but it was what the situation needed. She was the connective tissue between Voss's team, Lattimore's officers, the hospital evacuation staff, and the 4 patients still being moved on the 4th floor. She relayed updates in both directions, kept the radio channels from overlapping into chaos, and watched the parking garage with Ferris standing beside her. You see anything up there? She asked him quietly. 3rd level, west corner. There's a vehicle that hasn't moved since before we got here. He was shading his eyes with his hand. Could be nothing. Early arrival, someone who got here before the barricades went up. Could be. Could not be. I know. She radioed Lattimore with the vehicle observation. Lattimore relayed it to the officers in the garage. 40 seconds later, one of them came back. 3rd level, vehicle confirmed. Occupied. Driver not responding to approach. Requesting. Then the radio cut out. Not static. Cut. Like someone had turned it off. Emily and Ferris looked at each other. Voss? Emily called, keeping her voice flat. We may have a situation in the garage. Voss was already pulling on her helmet. Delacroix. Status. 4 minutes out on configuration. Make it 3. I can't make it. 3 minutes, Delacroix. From the parking garage, a simund. Not an explosion. Something smaller. A door, a shout, the movement of people. Then one of the officers' voices came back on the radio, breathless and clipped. Subject in custody. 3rd level. White male. Mid-30s. Electronic device in his possession. Securing now. The radio traffic from the garage went dense and overlapping. Emily filtered it. They have someone, she said. Command trigger? Ferris asked. Possibly. They're not calling it yet. If it was him and he's cuffed, then we just moved from command detonated back to timer. And we still don't know how long is on the clock. Ferris exhaled through his nose, looked at the containers. Then we're back to Delacroix. We're back to Delacroix, Emily said. 3 minutes and 40 seconds after the garage transmission, Delacroix looked up from the equipment truck and said, Configured. Ready to deploy. Voss was in full protective gear, Tran was beside her with the secondary disruptor unit. Rivera was on comms. Lattimore, Voss said, I need confirmation that the 100-foot perimeter is holding and that the east side of the building. She looked at Emily. Fourth floor patients? Emily had been on the radio with Dolores Huang's team for the last 2 minutes. Last patient exiting the stairwell now. Ambulance bay, north side. Building is clear? Building is clear. Something moved across Voss's face. Not relief, but a recalibration. The particular look of a person who has been doing arithmetic in the dark and has just been handed a flashlight. Okay, Voss said. We're going. She and Tran moved toward the containers. The robot had been repositioned to provide a secondary camera angle. Delacroix and Rivera monitored the feeds from the truck. Lattimore stood at the perimeter with 3 officers. Ferris stood beside Emily. Walt Greer, who had somehow remained in the vicinity after getting his brother to safety, stood 15 feet behind them and said nothing, and watched everything. The walk to the primary container was 40 feet. In protective gear, Voss covered it in a measured, unhurried pace that looked slow and was anything but. Tran split off toward the secondary, moving parallel. Emily watched the tablet feed over Delacroix's shoulder. Voss's gloved hands opened the primary container's top channel. The camera saw inside. Emily saw it on the feed. It was real. It had been real from the moment Ranger locked his stance and refused to move, and she had known that. But knowing something and seeing it on a camera feed were 2 different physical experiences, and the second one landed in the stomach. A device, compact, dense, constructed with the specific competence of someone who had done this before or had been taught by someone who had. Not artisanal, efficient. A metal casing, a cellular-connected circuit board, a main charge surrounded by what looked like metal fragments packed in a resin matrix. Shrapnel load, designed to propagate. The timer display was visible on the circuit board, a small digital readout, and Delacroix zoomed the camera in and Emily looked at the number on the display, and the number was Voss, Delacroix said. His voice had changed. Timer, active, reading 9 minutes 14 seconds. 9 minutes. Emily looked at the perimeter, the hospital building behind her, the ambulance bay on the north side where the last patients had just been taken out, the street beyond the property line where civilians had gathered. 9 minutes. Voss's voice on the radio was absolutely flat. Rivera, confirm the disruptor is operational. Confirmed. I'm going to need a precision deployment on the circuit board. The charge is packed tight. If the disruptor misaligns, we risk initiating rather than neutralizing. What do you need? 30 seconds and everybody to stop talking to me. Silence on the radio. Voss worked. Emily watched the tablet, watched Voss's hands, precise and unrushed inside heavy gloves, positioning the disruptor barrel at the specific angle that the configuration required, the angle that would fire a high-velocity jet of water into the circuit board and destroy the initiator without triggering the main charge. The margin for error on this was not large. The margin for error was the kind of thing that technicians described in millimeters and that non-technicians described as not thinking about. 8 minutes, 40 seconds on the timer. Tran's voice on the radio. Secondary unit, no internal charge, it's a shell. The wire was a decoy. Emily closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. The secondary unit was a decoy, which meant the device, all of it, the entire payload, was in the primary. 1 unit, not 2. The blast geometry she'd recalculated, the restaging of the gathering area, the concern about overlapping zones, all of it had been based on the assumption of 2 active charges, and one of them was empty. It also meant the blast radius was smaller than she'd feared. It also meant every second of the last 7 minutes that had been spent accounting for a second device had been spent correctly, because you don't assume a wire is a decoy until you know it's a decoy, and you don't know it's a decoy until someone goes and looks. 8 minutes, 20 seconds. Voss, Emily said quietly, you're looking at a single primary charge. Main patient population is clear. Street is as clear as it's going to get. Copy. Voss didn't look up. Now please stop talking to me. Emily stopped talking. She stood at the edge of the cleared zone with Ferris on her left and Ranger, who Lattimore's officer had finally brought to her, sitting at her right. The dog's posture had shifted slightly, not released, Not relaxed, but different. The difference between a held breath and a measured one. He could sense the change in the situation the way animals sense changes in air pressure. Emily put her hand on his head. 7 minutes, 50 seconds. Voss made a final adjustment to the disruptor. Emily thought, without intending to, about the maintenance worker Perry, who had been 8 feet from this container with a box cutter. About Nadine Bosch's phone calls, and Dale Pruitt's hand on her arm, and Officer Tully's handcuffs, and the 44 minutes of people telling her she was wrong. About Priya calling the state safety line from the parking lot, and Walt Greer's voice cutting through the crowd, and Derek Ferris pulling into the lot in his cracked bumper truck because a county liaison knew his name. About Ranger, who had known from the first second and had never stopped saying so. 7 minutes. Voss said, "Firing." The disruptor discharged with a sound that wasn't what most people expected. Not a bang, more a sharp hydraulic crack, like a door being forced in a tight frame. The camera feed showed the jet impact the circuit board, a flash of water dispersal, and then the timer display went dark. Everyone on the perimeter was still. Voss didn't move for 3 seconds. Then she leaned in, camera close, examining the initiator. "Rivera," she said, "I need a secondary assessment before I call this." Rivera moved forward with a handheld scanner. 15 seconds. 20. Rivera said, "Initiator is destroyed. Main charge is intact but non-initiating. No secondary trigger detected." Voss leaned back from the container. She keyed her radio, and her voice, when it came, was the controlled, professional monotone of someone delivering a finding at the end of a procedure. "Device neutralized. Primary initiator destroyed. Main charge secure. Requesting disposal team for controlled removal." And then, because she was human and not a machine, she added, "Good work." The radio filled with overlapping voices from every unit on the perimeter. Lattimore's officers, Garza, the fire captain Rosario, the parking garage team, dispatch. The noise of a crisis breaking apart into its aftermath. Emily heard it from a distance. Her hand was still on Ranger's head. Her heart rate was coming down from wherever it had been for the last hour, dropping in the slow, reluctant way that adrenaline releases when it's been running long enough to feel like a permanent state. Ferris said, beside her, "Your dog's going to need a good meal." "He gets chicken," Emily said. "He only eats chicken." Ferris almost smiled. "He earned it." Walt Greer appeared behind them, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the container from which a device that should have killed 100 people had just been safely destroyed. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, it was quiet. "Your name," he said. "What's your full name?" "Emily Carter?" Walt nodded, like he was filing it, like it was something he intended to remember. Around them, the machinery of aftermath was beginning. Officers removing their tactical gear, EMS units repositioning, a crowd at the perimeter that had gone from afraid to something more complicated. People talking and pointing, and some of them crying in the way people cry when the thing they feared didn't happen and the body doesn't quite know what to do with that. Lattimore walked over, radio in hand, expression unreadable in the specific way of people who are processing more than they're showing. "Carter," she said. Emily looked at her. "That man they took into custody in the garage." Lattimore paused. "He had a remote detonator. He'd been trying to activate it from the 3rd level of the structure." Emily waited. "It didn't work because the cellular trigger in the primary device needed line-of-sight signal to that specific carrier frequency, and the garage's concrete structure was attenuating it. He'd been trying to get a signal for 20 minutes. Lattimore looked at the container. "He was still trying when our officers reached him." Emily absorbed this. 20 minutes. The man had been in the garage trying to detonate a device full of shrapnel inside a hospital full of patients for 20 minutes while she had been standing 40 feet from it. "Who is he?" she asked. "That's what the investigation is going to determine." Lattimore's voice was careful. "But he had a hospital visitor ID badge, Riverstone Medical Center, issued 6 weeks ago." Emily went still. "An inside ID," Ferris said. "Current or past affiliation with the hospital is being assessed right now," Lattimore said. "Which means—" She stopped. "Which means this wasn't random," Emily said. Lattimore didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it either. She said, "I think you should probably come with me." And her tone had changed. Not the crisis management tone, something more deliberate, something that understood the conversation that was about to happen was different from the ones they'd been having. Emily looked at Ranger, at the container, at the hospital building, its east wing lit against the pale morning, windows that had held patients an hour ago and were now empty and quiet. Something had shifted in the last 60 seconds, the nature of what had happened, the shape of it. A bomb that could have been remotely detonated by someone with inside access. A device placed during a routine delivery window. A container that had been positioned just off-angle, as if the plan had partially gone wrong before Emily ever arrived. She thought about who had been told about deliveries, who had access to loading dock schedules, who had known that Tuesday morning was a peak traffic window for the east entrance. She thought about Dale Pruitt standing near the dock door before she'd even gotten there. She thought about Nadine Bosch's first call, the one that had lasted longer than the others, the one that had happened before the police arrived. "Lattimore," she said. "Yeah." "The investigation into who authorized that ID badge, how far back does that go?" Lattimore looked at her steadily. "As far as it needs to." And Emily Carter, who had spent an hour being arrested and dismissed and handcuffed in front of a crowd while a bomb sat 40 feet away, looked at the detective and understood that the crisis was over, and that something else had just begun. The investigation didn't wait for anyone to be ready. That was the thing about federal involvement. It didn't announce itself with paperwork and courtesies. It arrived the way it always arrived, which was fast and without negotiation, and by 11:30 that morning, 2 hours after Voss's team had neutralized the device, the east parking lot of Riverstone Medical Center contained 3 federal vehicles, a mobile command unit from the Texas Department of Public Safety, and a man named Special Agent Roland Decker, who had driven from San Antonio in under 3 hours, and who walked onto the property with the specific energy of someone who had been waiting for a case like this to land on his desk. Decker was 51, thin through the face, with the kind of careful eyes that processed a scene in layers. He'd spent 11 years in the Army before federal service, which meant that when he shook Emily's hand in the east parking lot and she told him her background without details, he filled in the details himself and moved on. He didn't waste time being impressed. He didn't waste time with unnecessary questions. He looked at the container, now secured, surrounded by EOD markers, waiting for disposal, and he looked at the hospital building, and he looked at Emily, and he said, "Walk me through it from the beginning, not the bomb, the morning." She walked him through it. He listened without interrupting. He wrote nothing down. That was one of the first things she noticed about him. No notebook, no recorder visible, which either meant he had a very good memory or that someone else was recording, and she suspected both were true. When she finished, he said, "The administrator, Bosch. First call she made when she arrived on scene. Who was she calling?" "I don't know. She didn't say." "Did you observe anything about the call? Duration? Her body language?" "It was longer than her other calls. She was facing away from the crowd. When it ended, she moved directly to Pruitt and said something I couldn't hear." Decker nodded. "And Pruitt, he went to get the delivery records." "He did. I don't know if he ever came back with them." "He didn't," Decker said. "We pulled the receiving office logs ourselves. The delivery was logged into the system at 7:42 a.m. under a vendor account that was authorized 6 weeks ago." He looked at her steadily. "The same week the visitor ID badge found on the subject in the garage was issued." 6 weeks. The same window. Emily had already done this math in her head, but hearing it confirmed aloud was different from the calculation. It had weight, it had sequence, it had the shape of something that had been planned rather than improvised. "Who authorized the vendor account?" she asked. "That's what we're determining." Decker looked at the hospital building. "We've secured the administrative office and the receiving office. Nobody in either department is going anywhere until we've talked to them." He paused. "You should know that Nadine Bosch is currently with our agents and has been for the last 40 minutes. Emily didn't respond to that. "She asked for a lawyer 20 minutes into the conversation," Decker added. The public piece of it happened at noon, which was when the press had gathered in sufficient numbers that ignoring them became its own story. There were 3 local news vehicles in the street beyond the property line, and a 4th that Emily recognized as a regional affiliate out of San Antonio, and by the time Sergeant Lattimore walked to the barrier to make a brief statement, the footage of the east parking lot and the EOD equipment and the marked container was already circulating on the kind of social media accounts that picked up emergency scanner traffic. Emily didn't watch the statement. She was in the mobile command unit with Decker and two of his agents, going through the timeline in the kind of detail that wasn't for public consumption, the kind that included her military background, her deployment history, the specific nature of Rangers training, and the sequence of decisions that had been made by her, by Pruitt, by Tully, by Bosch, in the 44 minutes between Rangers' first alert and Voss's neutralization. Decker's agents were thorough. They asked the same questions in different orders, which was standard, and they asked about things she hadn't expected. Her relationship with hospital administration prior to this morning, whether she'd had any prior interactions with Dale Pruitt that were adversarial, whether anyone had ever questioned her credentials or background during her employment at Riverstone. That last question landed differently than the others. Once, she said, about 3 months ago, Pruitt told me that a nurse had reported my dog as a disturbance near the receiving area. When I looked into it, the report didn't have a name attached. Pruitt said it was anonymous. The agent across from her wrote something down. Did you pursue it? I flagged it to HR. They said they'd look into it. She paused. I never heard back. Do you know who the HR contact was? A woman named Sandra Fell. She was Nadine Bosch's direct report. The agent wrote more. The story of the ID badge unraveled in the early afternoon. The way these things unraveled when federal agents started pulling authorization chains and every link led back to the same hands. The visitor ID badge found on the man in the garage, whose name was being withheld pending charging, which was standard, but whose face had already been captured on 5 different phones at the parking garage entrance and was circulating online regardless, had been issued through the hospital's vendor relations system. Vendor relations reported to procurement. Procurement reported to administration. Administration, at Riverstone Medical Center, meant Nadine Bosch. The vendor account that had authorized the delivery had been created 6 weeks ago by a user credential that belonged to a junior procurement officer named Keith Sauer, who was 26 and had been working at Riverstone for 8 months, and who, when Decker's agent sat across from him in the conference room that had been converted into an interview space, immediately started talking in the specific way of young people who understand they are in serious trouble and have decided that cooperation is the only variable they control. Keith Sauer said he'd been asked by Nadine Bosch to create the vendor account without going through standard approval channels. Bosch had told him it was a time-sensitive procurement situation and that the normal 3-week approval window would cause operational delays. She'd signed off on the request verbally. "Do you have anything in writing?" Decker's agent had asked. Keith Sauer had 3 emails. He'd kept them because he'd felt uncomfortable with the request at the time and hadn't been sure why. And one of the things young people who feel uncomfortable do is keep records without knowing exactly what they're keeping records of. The emails were in federal hands by 2 p.m. Dale Pruitt was interviewed in the hospital security office, which was now a federal interview space, which meant that the room where he'd told Emily to leave the property that morning was the same room where an agent named Torres sat across from him and placed a printed document on the table between them. Emily didn't witness this interview. She learned about it later, in pieces, from Lattimore, who had been present as the Ashford PD liaison. The document was a log of keycard access to the receiving area over the past 6 weeks. Pruitt's keycard had accessed the receiving corridor at 6:47 that morning, 55 minutes before the delivery arrived. The delivery that had been logged at 7:42, which meant Pruitt had been in the receiving area before the delivery, not after, at a time when the loading dock was not yet staffed. "Is there a reason your card was swiped in the receiving corridor at 6:47? Torres had asked. Pruitt had said he did routine walkthroughs. Torres had pulled a second document. Pruitt's keycard log for the previous 6 weeks, 0 pre-7 a.m. access events in the receiving corridor, not one. Pruitt had asked for a lawyer. He'd asked for it before Nadine Bosch had, which meant 2 of the 3 people who had publicly dismissed Emily's warning that morning, who had handcuffed her, had her removed, had told her she was disrupting hospital operations, were now sitting in separate rooms in the same building asking for legal representation. The third was Officer Marcus Tully, who had not asked for a lawyer and had instead, at the instruction of his sergeant, submitted a full written account of his actions that morning. The account was honest. It documented every decision he'd made and why he'd made it, including the specific moment when Nadine Bosch's presence had influenced his judgment. It documented the handcuffing. It documented Emily's requests and his refusals, and the exact sequence of events at the patrol car when the handcuffs had come off. It was, by most measures, a damning account of his own conduct. It was also the account of a young officer who had made bad calls in a high-pressure situation and was not attempting to reframe them. Lattimore had told Emily about the report in the parking lot, mid-afternoon, in the flat tone of a supervisor who was navigating multiple competing assessments of a subordinate. "What happens to him?" Emily had asked. "That's above my pay grade right now." Lattimore had looked at the hospital building. "But he submitted the account voluntarily. That matters." Emily had thought about Tully's face when the handcuffs came off. The exact moment. The math she'd watched him do. He'd been wrong about everything up until that moment, and then he'd been right. And being right had required him to publicly walk back a decision he'd already committed to in front of a crowd. That wasn't easy. It wasn't an excuse, but it wasn't nothing. "He's young," Emily said. "Yeah," Lattimore said. "He is, Bob." By 3 in the afternoon, the information architecture of what had happened at Riverstone Medical Center that morning had been assembled well enough to have a shape. And the shape was this. Someone with access to hospital administrative systems had facilitated the placement of an explosive device designed to detonate during peak patient hours in the east wing of the building. The device had been constructed and delivered by an outside party. The inside facilitation had included the creation of a fraudulent vendor account, the issuance of a visitor credential to a known associate, and, the part that was still being confirmed, the possible active misdirection of security response during the critical window between the device's arrival and its discovery. That last part was what the keycard log suggested about Pruitt. It was what the federal agents were still working to establish. Misdirection was harder to prove than access. Proving that someone had been in a corridor at a particular time was one thing. Proving why they were there and what they'd done was another. The man from the garage had been identified by late afternoon. His name was Terry Walcott, and he had a prior federal charge for conspiracy to commit arson that had resulted in a plea agreement 9 years ago, and he had worked for a private logistics company that had done business with Riverstone Medical Center's procurement division, which reported to Bosch. At 4:15, something happened that nobody had anticipated in the morning's planning, because the morning's planning had not included the possibility of the story leaving the east parking lot. The footage had been circulating for hours. The crowd video from the moment Tully put the cuffs on Emily, shaky and partially obscured but clear enough. Her hands being bound in front of the hospital entrance. Ranger sitting rigid in the background. The crowd's reaction. Then, in a separate video posted 40 minutes later, Ferris arriving. Then the EOD vehicles. Then, from a distance, the disruptor deployment. Then Lattimore at the barrier giving her statement, which mentioned, carefully, briefly, that a trained K-9 had provided the initial alert and that a hospital employee had brought the threat to security's attention and been detained before the threat was confirmed. Had been detained. That phrase, in the statement at noon, had been careful. By 4:15, it had become something else. Because someone, Emily never found out who, had connected the noon statement to the morning's arrest footage, and the combination had been picked up by a regional news account with a large following, and then by 2 national accounts, and then by a journalist at a Dallas outlet who had done the additional step of pulling public records on the EOD response and confirmed what the footage suggested. A nurse with a detection dog had flagged an explosive device, been handcuffed, and had the cuffs removed only after a bystander, a former Marine, had intervened. By 4:30, Emily Carter's name was in 12,000 posts. She was in the mobile command unit when Decker told her. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without editorial. "Your name is public," he said. "We didn't release it. The footage identified you." Emily processed this. "Okay. Is there anyone you need to contact, family?" "I'll handle it." The hospital's PR office is going to release a statement. We've seen a draft. He paused. The draft credits hospital staff with an effective emergency response. Emily looked at him. We've asked them to revise it, Decker said. They're revising it. Who's making that call? If Bosch is not currently in a position to authorize anything. Decker set down the folder he'd been holding. The board has been notified. They've placed her administrative functions on hold pending the investigation. They're also, he said this carefully, they're also looking at the broader question of who else in the administrative structure had knowledge of or involvement in the vendor account creation. Sandra fell, Emily said. We're talking to her. Keith Sauer said he was asked by Bosch directly. If Fell was Bosch's direct report and processed the HR flag I submitted 3 months ago and never followed up, we know about the flag. It's in the file. He looked at her. You kept records. I keep records of everything. Something moved across Decker's face that might, in a different person, have been a smile. Good habit. The first call from the state came at 5 p.m. It went to Lattimore, who relayed it to Decker, who walked to where Emily was sitting on the rear bumper of a paramedic unit with Ranger beside her and a cup of cold coffee she'd been nursing for an hour. State Attorney General's office wants to talk to you, Decker said. Emily looked at her coffee. Today? Tomorrow morning, formal interview. They're coordinating with the federal investigation. He paused. They're also, this is separate, a representative from the governor's office reached out to the DPS commander. The governor wants a briefing on the response. Emily absorbed this. What kind of briefing? The kind that mentions names. He let that sit. Yours specifically. She looked at Ranger. He was lying beside her now, finally released from his alert posture, exhausted in the particular way working dogs get exhausted, not physically spent, but mentally wrung out, the deep tiredness of a brain that had been running at operational pitch for hours. He'd eaten the chicken she'd gotten from the hospital cafeteria, which had still been serving from a station on the west side, and now he had his chin on his paws and his eyes were half closed. He did the work, Emily said. He did, Decker agreed, but somebody had to trust what he was saying. Emily didn't answer that. Walt Greer appeared from somewhere. He'd been in and out of the lot all day, sitting with his brother in the gathering area during the worst of it, and then reappearing as if he'd never left, which was a quality Emily associated with certain kinds of former military men who had a natural orientation toward situations that required staying. He sat down on a folding chair that someone had placed near the paramedic unit. My brother's going back for the rest of his session tomorrow, Walt said. He's annoyed about the interruption, told the nurse it ruined his whole week. That sounds like Eugene, Emily said. She'd never met Eugene. Walt accepted this without noting the oddness of it. You eat anything besides that coffee? The cafeteria had chicken. Human food. I'm not particularly hungry. Walt looked at her. You've been running on adrenaline since 7 a.m. Your hands are steady, but your eyes are tired. Eat something. Emily looked at her hands. They were, in fact, steady. She'd always been better at functional control than at rest. The adrenaline came and went without her choosing it, but the surface stayed level, which had been useful in her previous life and was useful now and occasionally made people around her uncomfortable because it didn't look like a normal stress response. I'll eat, she said. Good. Walt looked at the hospital. What happens now to the people who I don't know exactly. But something happens. Yes, she said. Something happens. Something happened. The arrest footage and its context had moved fast enough by early evening that Nadine Bosch's name was circulating publicly, even before the hospital's revised PR statement was released at 6 p.m. The revised statement, shorter than the draft, more careful, notably absent of any claim about administrative effectiveness, confirmed that a Riverstone Medical Center employee had alerted security to a suspicious delivery, that law enforcement had responded, and that a device had been neutralized by EOD. It thanked the responding agencies. It did not mention Emily by name, but the footage had already done that, and the absence of her name in the statement was itself a story. By 7 p.m., the hospital board had held an emergency meeting. Emily knew this because Decker told her, And Decker knew because one of his agents was in the building and the board had requested the federal assessment of the administrative findings before voting on anything. What they voted on: the immediate suspension of Dale Pruitt pending the criminal investigation, the placement of Nadine Bosch on administrative leave with access to all systems revoked, the appointment of an interim operations director, the initiation of an independent audit of the procurement and vendor relations divisions going back 18 months. 18 months, which predated Keith Sauer's hire by 10 months, which meant whatever Decker's agents were looking for in the procurement records, they expected to find a pattern, not an incident. Officer Tully came to find Emily at 7:45. She was in the parking lot, standing beside her car, which she hadn't driven since she'd parked it at 6:50 that morning before her shift. 13 hours ago. The car seemed like an artifact from another period of time. Tully was in civilian clothes. He'd gone off shift at 4 and come back, which she hadn't expected. He looked like he hadn't slept, which was reasonable since it was 7:45 and he'd been awake since before 6. I wanted to... He stopped, tried again. I filed the account. The written account. I know. I wanted you to know that I know I made the wrong call. He said it without hedging. No qualifiers, no structural repositioning of blame. All of it, the arrest, not making the call to verify the container, all of it. Emily looked at him. He was 23, maybe 24. He had the specific expression of someone who had done something they couldn't undo and was not trying to pretend otherwise. Okay, she said. I'm not asking for... I don't need you to... He stopped again. I just wanted to say it directly, not through a report. I heard you, Emily said. He nodded, looked at Ranger, who was in the back seat of the car with the window cracked. Is he okay? He's tired. He'll be fine. Tully nodded again. Then he said, for what it's worth, what you did out there was... He stopped because he was trying to pay a compliment and it kept coming out wrong. I've been in this job less than 2 years. I didn't know what I was looking at. That's not an excuse. No, Emily agreed. It's not. He absorbed that. Okay? But you took the cuffs off, she said. When you recalculated, you took the cuffs off. You didn't double down. She looked at him. That matters more than people think. He didn't look relieved by this, which many understood it as what it was, which was accurate rather than forgiving, and he thanked her with a nod and left. She watched him go. The thing about Nadine Bosch was that her composure held longer than almost everyone expected. She had remained composed through the initial federal interview, composed through the request to secure her device, composed when her administrative access was suspended. The composure was the kind built on a long and successful professional history of making problems go away before they became problems. And for as long as she believed this situation was a problem she could manage, the composure held. It broke at 8:15 p.m. when Decker's agents presented her with the third email. The third email was not from Keith Sauer's file. It was from a server backup that the federal team had requested from the hospital's IT infrastructure. A backup that captured messages sent through the hospital's internal system in a window that predated Sauer's involvement. The email had been sent from Bosch's account to an internal address that no longer existed in the active employee directory because the account it belonged to had been decommissioned 4 months ago. The account had belonged to the previous head of security at Riverstone Medical Center, the previous head of security before Dale Pruitt. The email, sent 11 months ago, discussed a procurement opportunity with a logistics partner and included a reference to a delivery schedule and the phrase, the window we discussed, and the logistics partner identified in the email was the company that employed Terry Walcott. 11 months ago. Emily had been hired at Riverstone Medical Center 11 months and 3 weeks ago. When Decker told her this in the mobile command unit at 9 p.m., sitting across from her with the folder open between them, the room was quiet for long enough that she could hear the residual activity in the parking lot through the vehicle's walls. They knew you were coming, she said. We don't know that yet. But the timeline is something we're examining very carefully. Decker's voice was neutral in the way of someone who had a hypothesis and was being professionally cautious about it. The flag you submitted to HR 3 months ago. The anonymous complaint about your dog. The timing of the vendor account creation 6 weeks ago. He looked at her. When did you first report the medication discrepancy? The one that turned out to be real? Emily thought. 7 months ago. To whom? Pruitt, initially, then H.R. Sandra Fell. And the supply closet with the chemical smell? 4 months ago. Pruitt. Decker looked at the folder. The supply closet report went nowhere. Pruitt told me it had been investigated and resolved. It wasn't investigated. Decker's voice didn't change. The report was filed and closed the same day, by Pruitt. The implications of this settled in layers. Emily sat with them. She was good at sitting with implications. It was something she'd learned in environments where the implications were sometimes the most important information available, and reacting to them before understanding them completely was how mistakes compounded. What she was understanding, she hadn't been employed at Riverstone for 11 months because she'd needed the job. She'd been good at her work, and she'd been quiet about her background, and she'd tried to be unremarkable, but she hadn't been unremarkable enough because the things she'd flagged, the medication discrepancy, the chemical smell, had flagged her, had made someone pay attention to the float nurse who asked too many questions and kept records and had a dog she brought to work. Someone had been paying attention long enough to file a complaint, to close a report the same day it was filed, to issue a visitor ID badge to a man with a prior federal charge, to create a vendor account, to arrange a delivery. She thought about this container sitting slightly off angle, delivered by a driver who hadn't positioned it correctly. She thought about Tuesday morning, peak traffic, east entrance, the highest concentration of people, patients, families, staff, moving through the area that Ranger had never been allowed to approach during a delivery window because Pruitt had told her the dock area was off limits during receiving hours. Except that morning she'd been 4 minutes late. Except that morning she'd taken the east entrance instead of the main because she was thinking about Dorinda's incomplete notes. Except Ranger had been with her. If she'd been on time, if she'd taken the main entrance, the dog never reaches the dock. She said this out loud, quietly, to the mobile command unit and to Decker and to the particular stillness of 9 p.m. after a day that had started at 6:50 in a parking lot. Decker looked at her for a moment. "We don't know," he said. "I know," she said, "but I know." He didn't argue with that. Outside the lot was quieter now. The news vehicles were still in the street. The EOD markers were still around the container. The hospital's east wing was still dark. Tomorrow it would be full again. Patients, families, staff, the ordinary machinery of a medical institution doing what medical institutions did, and the East Dock would be a crime scene for a while, and then it would be a loading dock again. Emily looked at the folder on the table, at the email, at the 11-month timeline laid out in pieces. "Is there more in there?" she asked, meaning the server backup. "Our digital forensics team is still working through it." "What are you expecting to find?" Decker looked at her steadily. "Honestly, I think we're going to find that this morning was not the first time, that the procurement irregularities go back further than the Walcott connection, that there is a financial motive underneath this that we haven't fully surfaced yet." He paused. "And I think when we surface it, it's going to implicate people who aren't currently in our interviews." Emily absorbed this. "How many people?" "I don't know yet." He looked at the folder. "But the 18-month audit window the board authorized isn't accidental. Someone on that board has already done some math." She looked at the folder for a moment longer, at the email with the phrase, "the window we discussed," sent 11 months ago, before she'd arrived, before the first discrepancy flag, before any of it. "Decker," she said. "Yeah. The previous head of security, the one whose account that email was sent to. We're locating him." "Where is he now?" Decker looked at her. "That's what we're working on." He said it in the careful tone of someone who was going to give her limited information and wanted her to understand that the limitation was deliberate. "He left Riverstone 8 months ago. We have a last known address in Austin." 8 months ago, Emily said. 4 months after I filed the supply closet report. Decker said nothing. "And 4 months before the vendor account was created." "Carter." He said her name without inflection. "I need you to let us work this." She met his eyes. "I know." "Because if you start—" "I know," she said again. She did know. She knew the shape of investigations, knew the way civilian involvement in federal cases created problems that outweighed the assistance, knew that Decker was competent and that his team was capable, and that the right thing was to give them everything she had and then step back and let the machinery run. She also knew that the former head of security at Riverstone Medical Center, a man she'd never met, whose name was on a decommissioned account in a server backup, had left 8 months ago under circumstances that no one had yet explained to her, and that 8 months ago was a date that lined up with other dates in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like a sequence. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize, Texas area code, a 512 prefix. Austin. She looked at it for a moment. Decker was looking at something in the folder. The call went to voicemail. She put the phone face down on the table and looked at Decker, who looked up. "You should probably know," she said carefully, "that I just got a call from an Austin area code. Unknown number." Decker looked at her phone. Then he looked at his own phone and made a call, and the words he said into it were short and directed, and his tone had changed in the specific way of someone who has just had a calculation confirmed. And Emily sat across from him in the mobile command unit at 9 p.m. and waited. The voicemail notification appeared on her screen. She didn't open it. She waited for Decker to finish his call, and when he lowered the phone and looked at her, the expression on his face was the kind that preceded significant information. "The Austin address," he said. "We sent an agent to it 2 hours ago." "And?" "The man hasn't been living there for 3 months." He looked at her steadily. "But someone has been using the address to receive mail." He paused. "Including a package, received 6 weeks ago, from a logistics company. The same 6-week window." Emily looked at her phone, at the voicemail notification sitting on the screen. "I need your consent to access that voicemail," Decker said. She unlocked the phone and slid it across the table. The voicemail lasted 47 seconds. Decker played it twice, holding the phone between them, and neither of them spoke during either playback. The voice was male, mid-range, with the particular flatness of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say and was delivering it carefully. Not nervously, carefully, which was a different thing. The voice said, "You don't know me. My name is Roy Callahan. I was the security director at Riverstone before Pruitt. I left because I was told to leave, and I was told to leave because I found the same things you found. The procurement irregularities, the vendor relationships, the money moving through accounts that didn't match any legitimate contract. I documented it. I gave it to Bosch. 3 weeks later, my position was eliminated. I kept copies. I've been trying to figure out who to give them to for 8 months. I saw your name on the news tonight. I think you might be the right person. Call me back." Then the number again, then silence. Decker set the phone down. "Roy Callahan," he said. Not to Emily, to himself, running the name against whatever he already knew. "Is he credible?" Emily asked. "The timing is credible. The pattern is credible." He picked up his own phone. "He's also potentially a witness who's been sitting on evidence for 8 months, which means he's been afraid of something, which means there's something to be afraid of." He was already dialing. "I need you to not call that number." "I know. And I need you to understand that whatever he has, wherever this goes next, it's federal jurisdiction, and my team is going to run it." "Decker." She looked at him directly. "I'm a nurse with a dog. I was never trying to run it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he walked to the far end of the mobile unit to make his call, and Emily sat with the quiet weight of 47 seconds of a man's voice and 8 months of someone being afraid, and she thought about all the spaces and institutions where things like this lived, not in dark corners, but in bright, administrative, procedurally correct spaces, filed and stamped and routed to the right person, who turned out to be exactly the wrong person. Roy Callahan was taken into protective custody in Austin at 11:40 p.m. He came voluntarily, which said something, and he came with a portable hard drive and a manila folder and the look of a man who had been carrying weight in solitude long enough that putting it down felt more like collapse than relief. Emily didn't learn the contents of what he brought until the following morning, and she didn't learn all of it then. Some of it was sealed, some of it was still being processed. But what Decker told her at 7 a.m., over bad coffee in the parking lot, was enough to complete the shape of it. Callahan had documented a procurement fraud operation running through Riverstone's vendor relations division for nearly 2 years. contracts awarded to companies with no legitimate service record, payments processed through accounts that routed through shell entities before landing in personal accounts. The amounts were not small. The network was not simple. And at its center, with her signature on the authorization chains and her name on the emails and her credential on the system access logs, was Nadine Bosch. Bosch had not acted alone. There were two other hospital administrators whose names appeared in the documents, both of whom had already retained attorneys by the time Decker's team began cross-referencing Callahan's files with the server backup. Pruitt had been a facilitator, not an architect, but someone who had understood what was happening and had made himself useful to the people running it, which under federal law made him equally exposed. The explosive device had been the endgame of something much smaller and much uglier, a woman trying to protect a financial operation by removing the variable that kept surfacing inconvenient questions. The medication discrepancy Emily had flagged 7 months ago had, when properly traced, pointed toward a procurement irregularity in pharmaceutical supply contracts, one of the revenue streams in Bosch's network. The supply closet with the chemical smell had been adjacent to a storage area used by one of the fraudulent vendors. Emily hadn't known any of this. She'd just been a nurse who noticed things and wrote them down. That was what they couldn't manage. Not her military background. They hadn't known about that. Or if they had, they'd underestimated what it meant. What they couldn't manage was someone who noticed things and wrote them down and didn't stop. The press conference was at 10 a.m. It was held outside the Riverstone Medical Center main entrance, which was open again, and the east wing was operational, and the loading dock was still a crime scene, but the hospital was functioning, patients in beds, staff on rounds. The ordinary life of a medical institution reasserting itself over the extraordinary event of the day before. Decker's agency, DPS, the Ashford PD, and a representative from the State Attorney General's office stood together at a temporary podium. The Attorney General's representative spoke first, a compact, measured woman named Assistant A.G. Patricia Soles, who delivered a clear and detailed account of the charges being filed. Federal conspiracy, procurement fraud, facilitation of a terrorist act. The charges named Nadine Bosch, Dale Pruitt, and two other administrators whose names Emily had not heard before that morning. They named Terry Walcott. They noted that Roy Callahan was cooperating with the federal investigation as a protected witness. Patricia Soles said all of this in the flat, factual cadence of legal proceedings, and the press recorded it, and behind the barrier the crowd of reporters and cameras and the smaller crowd of hospital staff and families and community members who had gathered listened to a woman read out the names of people who had tried to kill a building full of patients over money. And the reading of those names in public, in the specific gravity of legal language, was a different kind of event than anything that had happened in a parking lot the day before. It was accountability arriving, not as a feeling, but as a structure, a thing that had weight and form and consequences attached. Pruitt was formally suspended without pay pending trial. The legal process would take months, possibly longer. Federal cases always did. But the suspension was immediate and public, announced by the hospital board in a written statement that also announced Nadine Bosch's termination and the termination of the two additional administrators. The board statement was careful and thorough, which meant someone on that board had been preparing for exactly this moment and had used the time well. Officer Tully was placed on administrative review, standard procedure in any case involving an unlawful detention finding, which was what the AG's preliminary assessment had already classified the handcuffing as. The review would determine whether the violation was disciplinary or terminable. Emily had given her account to the review panel honestly and completely. She had not softened the handcuffing or its context. She had also reported, honestly and completely, the moment Tully had recalculated and removed the cuffs and the subsequent actions he'd taken in support of the response. What happened to him after that was the panel's determination, not hers. She told Lattimore this. Lattimore had looked at her with the expression of someone who understood what it cost to be accurate rather than generous. "That's the right call," Lattimore said. "I know," Emily said. "It's also a hard one." "Yeah." Lattimore had looked out at the parking lot. "Usually are." The state recognition ceremony was 2 weeks later, held in a function room at the Ashford City Hall, which was a smaller and more institutional space than the occasion probably warranted, but nobody had suggested a larger venue, and Emily wouldn't have wanted one. She arrived in clothes that were not scrubs and were not her most comfortable option, and that she'd bought 2 days before at a store she'd had to ask Priya to help her find. Because Priya had called 3 times since the incident, and Emily had answered twice, and the second time had agreed to let Priya help her find dress clothes, which was how she'd ended up with a dark blue jacket that fit reasonably well, and shoes that were not entirely broken in. Ranger was with her. Nobody had suggested he shouldn't be. The room held maybe 80 people. State officials, DPS representatives, the EOD team, Voss and Delacroix, and Tran and Rivera. Derek Ferris in a collared shirt that was clearly an infrequent event for him. Sergeant Lattimore in dress uniform, a handful of hospital staff, including Priya and Dolores Huang from the 4th floor, whose name Emily had learned in the aftermath and whose decisions during the evacuation had been quietly noted in every report that mattered. Walt Greer was in the 2nd row with Eugene beside him. Eugene was in a wheelchair and had the pale, slightly irritable look of a man who was not well and was not going to let that stop him from being somewhere he wanted to be. There were families. Emily hadn't expected that. Parents with children, older couples, a woman with a teenager who kept looking at Ranger with the specific fixation of a kid who was trying not to show how much they wanted to pet the dog. These were the people who had been inside the hospital, or who had family inside the hospital, on Tuesday morning. They'd come to a City Hall function room 2 weeks later because they'd wanted to be in the same room as the person who'd stood 40 feet from a bomb and refused to move. Emily stood at the back of the room while the officials spoke and did not hear most of what they said. Not because she was inattentive, but because the part of her brain that processed institutional language had apparently decided this was not a situation requiring it. She heard Ranger's breathing beside her. She heard someone's child ask a question in a whisper and get a whispered answer. She heard the particular sound of a room full of people who were present for a specific reason and knew it. Patricia Soules spoke again, and this time her language was less measured, not performatively emotional, but less sealed. She described what had been prevented. She used numbers. The patient census on the East Wing that morning, the staff count, the number of families in the building during peak visiting hours. And the numbers were not abstract. They were the population of an ordinary Tuesday morning in a hospital that had nearly become something else. She said Emily Carter's name. There was a plaque, which Emily had been told about and had decided in advance she would accept without making a face. The plaque was from the state, and a second commendation was from the DPS, and a third, unexpected, was a letter on military letterhead from a branch of the Army that Emily had not expected to be acknowledged by in a public setting, and whose decision to send the letter meant that someone, somewhere, had decided that 11 months working as a float nurse while carrying a retired K-9 was not something to keep at a distance. She accepted all 3. She said thank you without elaborating, because she had not prepared a speech and had no intention of giving one, and the officials who had arranged the ceremony had been told this in advance and had factored it in. Then Walt Greer stood up. He didn't ask permission. He was 63 years old and a former sergeant major, and he stood up from the 2nd row and turned to face the room and said what he wanted to say, which was not a speech exactly, but was something more direct than a speech. I was in the parking lot that morning, he said. I watched them put cuffs on this woman while her dog was telling anyone who knew how to listen that there was a bomb 40 feet away. I watched a security director tell her to leave, and a police officer agree with him, and a hospital administrator act like the inconvenience was her. He stopped for a moment. I've been in enough situations to know that when someone with real knowledge says a real thing clearly and gets dismissed, it's usually not because what they're saying is wrong. It's because the wrong people are the ones with the authority. The room was very quiet. She saved my brother's life, Walt said. She saved my life. She saved people in that building who didn't know she was doing it and who still don't know her name. He looked at Emily. I know her name, and I'll know it for whatever time I've got left. He sat down. Eugene, beside him, said something inaudible. Walt said something back. Emily suspected it was not particularly sentimental, which made her almost smile. Priya found her afterward, in the corridor outside the function room, where Emily had taken Ranger for a water break and some quiet. You okay? Priya asked. I'm fine. That was... Walt's thing was, yeah. Priya crouched down and looked at Ranger, who examined her with the measured interest of a dog who had met enough people to know most of them were fine. Can I? She held out her hand. He'll tell you if he doesn't want to be touched, Emily said. Ranger sniffed Priya's hand and then allowed her to scratch behind his ear with the dignified tolerance of a dog who considers this his due. Priya looked up at Emily. They offered me the float coordinator position for the East Wing. Are you taking it? I think so. Maybe. Priya looked back at Ranger. I called the safety line because it looked wrong. That was the whole thing. It just looked wrong and I didn't know what else to do. That was enough, Emily said. Is it always enough? Just doing the thing that looks right? Emily thought about this honestly, because Priya was asking it honestly and deserved an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. No, she said. Sometimes you do the right thing, and it doesn't change anything. Sometimes the container is nothing, and you look like a person who caused a scene. Sometimes the timing is different, and the outcome is different. She looked at Ranger. But not doing it because it might not work. That's a different kind of cost. That one you carry. Priya nodded slowly. Okay. Take the position, Emily said. Yeah? You called when you didn't know what else to do. That's exactly who should be coordinating a floor. Priya stood, looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to say something. Then, what are you going to do? Decker had asked her a version of this question 2 days after the incident in the mobile command unit in the last formal interview session. He'd asked it at the end, after the substantive questions, in the tone of something personal rather than professional. Riverstone is going to need nursing staff during the restructure, he'd said, and the interim director has already indicated you're welcome back. I know. But? She'd looked at the folder on the table, at Roy Callahan's hard drive and its evidence bag, at the whole architecture of what had been built around her without her knowledge for 11 months. I've been thinking, she said, about what I'm actually good at. Decker had waited. I'm a nurse. I'm a good nurse. But the thing I was doing here, the discrepancy flags, the reports, the noticing, that's not a nursing function. That's a different function. What function is that? She'd thought about how to say it accurately, finding the thing that doesn't fit before it becomes the thing that kills someone. Decker had been quiet for a moment. Then, the DPS has a division that does threat assessment consultation for medical and public facilities. They've been trying to build a K9 integration component for 2 years and haven't found the right person. Emily had looked at him. I'm not recruiting you, he said. I'm telling you that if you were looking for a function, that function exists. She told Priya, something new? Priya looked at her. Like what? Like using what I actually know, in a place that wants it. Emily looked down at Ranger, who had finished his water and was looking up at her with the steady, present attention of a dog who was always ready. We've been underutilized. Priya smiled, a real one, unguarded. I think that's the understatement of the year. Emily almost smiled back. Not quite, but close enough that Priya saw it and understood it as what it was. The formal offer from the DPS came 3 weeks later, in writing, which was how Emily had asked for it. The position was titled Threat Assessment Specialist, Medical Infrastructure, which was a title she'd neither chosen nor objected to. The scope included facility assessment, K9 detection integration, staff training, and coordination with federal and state law enforcement during active response situations. It paid more than nursing, which she had not asked about, and was not the reason she accepted, but which was noted. She accepted it on a Tuesday. She didn't choose Tuesday deliberately. That was just when the paperwork cleared. So, the trials were months away. The legal machinery moved at its own pace, and she'd learned not to calibrate her sense of resolution to its timeline. What she knew was that Bosch, Pruitt, Pruitt and the others had been charged. That Walcott had been charged with federal weapons and conspiracy counts that carried the kind of sentencing range that did not leave room for optimism about one's next decade. That Roy Callahan was cooperating and protected and had, She'd heard secondhand, lost 30 pounds in the 8 months he'd been carrying his hard drive around Austin and had slowly been gaining it back. She knew that the east wing of Riverstone Medical Center was operational, that Dolores Huang had been recognized by the hospital board for her evacuation leadership, that Priya had taken the coordinator position and by all accounts was good at it. She knew that Eugene Greer was still doing dialysis on Tuesdays, annoyed about the interruption to his schedule that had happened weeks ago and showing no signs of forgiving anyone for it. She knew that Derek Ferris had been hired as a security consultant for the county, which meant the cracked bumper truck was in a county lot now, and the man who'd driven it 23 minutes on short notice because a liaison knew his name had somewhere useful to be. She knew that Marcus Tully had been retained after his administrative review, assigned to additional training, and was still on patrol in Ashford. She didn't know whether he was a different officer than the one who'd put the handcuffs on her. She suspected he was working on it. The morning she started the new position, she took Ranger to the park before sunrise, the way she did most mornings, and she sat on a bench at the edge of the running trail and watched the light change over the tree line, and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she'd developed in the years after her last deployment, when thinking about specific things had been difficult, and thinking about nothing had been the alternative. Ranger sat beside her, comfortable, present, breathing slow. He was 10 years old. His left rear haunch still bothered him in cold weather, and he was slower on stairs than he used to be, and he slept more than he once had, and he was still, in every way that mattered, the sharpest instrument she had ever worked with, the one that had found the thing no one else would look for and held his position for 51 minutes while the world around him decided whether to believe him. She put her hand on his back. People thought that courage was something you summoned in a single moment, that you reached a point of maximum pressure and you either had it or you didn't, and then the moment passed. She'd believed that once, roughly, in the way young people who train hard believe things that haven't been tested yet. What she knew now was different. Courage wasn't a moment. It was a posture. It was deciding, in the absence of support, in the face of dismissal, with handcuffs on your wrists and an administrator telling you to leave, to stay in the position your knowledge required. It was the decision to keep broadcasting when no one was receiving. It was 51 minutes of holding an alert that nobody wanted to read. She'd been underestimated by people who looked at a nurse with a dog and saw a problem to be managed. They had not looked closely enough. They had seen the surface, the scrubs, the float status, the unremarkable Tuesday arrival, and they had not looked at what was underneath, which was 8 years of training and deployment and surviving specific situations that didn't show up on HR paperwork. That was their mistake, not hers. She wasn't angry about it. She'd been, briefly, in the immediate hours, the particular cold anger that comes from being right and ignored at the same time. But anger had never been a useful long-term fuel for her, and she'd let it go the way she let most things go, which was not easily, but deliberately. What she kept instead was simpler. She kept the knowledge that she'd stood in the right place at the right moment and hadn't moved, and that 40 feet away something terrible had been waiting, and that because she didn't move it had been stopped. Not perfectly, not smoothly, not the way a movie would have arranged it. She'd been in handcuffs. She'd been afraid and hadn't shown it, and that hadn't made her less afraid. She'd been wrong about the secondary container being active and right about everything that mattered. It had been real and unclean and enough. Ranger lifted his head, watched something move in the tree line, a bird probably, or the shift of wind, then lowered it again. She stood. He stood with her, moving into position at her left side, the old habit of it, the muscle memory that both of them carried. "All right," she said. He looked up at her. Ready. She had somewhere to be, people to train, facilities to walk, systems to examine for the thing that didn't fit. She had a function now, with a name and a paycheck and a scope, and it was not more than what she'd always been doing. It was just the same thing, in a place where it was finally wanted. She clipped his lead. They left the park in the early light, the dog and the woman, heading toward whatever Tuesday held, and neither of them looked back.